On June 26, 1944, at Hollandia Air Base, the man who held the secret to making the P-38 Lightning almost untouchable walked into a crude, palm-thatched recreation hall. He was a true civilian with a trick, and his impossible trick would revolutionize the air war in the Pacific. Inside, Ace Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Macdonald was focused on a game of checkers, unaware that his quiet visitor was America's most famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh. The Lone Eagle, America's most celebrated aviator, stood in the remote jungle outpost, asking permission to discuss P-38 combat operations. An impossible interruption. The 475th, known by a name that struck fear into their enemies, Satan's Angels, was one of the hottest, most effective combat outfits in the entire Pacific theater. Their pilots, a collection of aggressive and skilled flyers, took every contest seriously, whether it was a dogfight at 20,000 feet or a simple game of checkers in the suffocating heat of the jungle. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the flimsy screen door, a dark silhouette cutting through the glaring light. A man stood there, neither a soldier nor a familiar face from the base. He introduced himself, but his name was lost in the jungle buzz and the intense focus of the game. Macdonald, his patience worn thin by the heat and the strain of command, was annoyed at the interruption and about to wave the stranger off. But the civilian repeated his introduction. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet it carried an undeniable weight, a calm confidence that was impossible to ignore. Charles Lindbergh? The checkers game was forgotten. The pieces sat frozen on the board, a silent testament to a moment that was about to pivot the direction of the air war. This wasn't just any civilian. This was the Charles Lindbergh, the man who had single-handedly conquered the Atlantic Ocean 17 years earlier. A living myth, America's most famous and revered aviator. And he was standing here, in this remote corner of a brutal war. Thousands of miles from home in a combat zone, he was politically forbidden from even entering, asking to discuss the combat operations of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. What neither Macdonald nor Smith could possibly know in that moment was that this interruption was not just about a checkers game. It was a hinge point in history, a single, quiet conversation that would spark a revolution in long-range fighter operations, stretching the reach of American air power in a way that the aircraft's own designers and engineers had deemed impossible. The story of how a civilian consultant effectively doubled the combat range of America's premier twin-engine fighter is not merely a technical tale of engines and fuel flows. It is a narrative of deeply entrenched institutional resistance being shattered by irrefutable evidence, of pilots being forced to unlearn their most basic training and trust cold mathematics over their gut instincts, and of one man's specialized, almost obsessive mastery of fuel efficiency, altering the very map of the war. The P-38J Lightning was a beast, an absolute marvel of aviation engineering. It looked like nothing else in the sky, with its unique and instantly recognizable twin-boom design. The Germans, who had faced it over Europe, had given it a grudgingly respectful nickname, Der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. It was fast, could climb like a rocket to high altitudes, and it packed a devastating punch. Unlike other American fighters that had wing-mounted guns requiring a convergence point, the P-38's entire armament was concentrated in its central nose cone, one brutal 20mm cannon and 4 heavy 50 caliber machine guns. This meant its stream of fire was a coherent, buzzsaw-like force that could shred an enemy aircraft from hundreds of yards away. But for all its strengths, it had a heartbreaking, often fatal flaw, an Achilles heel that was magnified 100-fold in the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Range. The distances in the Pacific were simply gargantuan, almost beyond comprehension. An operational map of the theater was a terrifying canvas of tiny, scattered islands separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles of unforgiving water. Missions to distant Japanese-held bases were a brutal, unforgiving calculation of fuel versus time. Pilots would fly for 3, sometimes 4, hours just to reach the target, engage in a few frantic, adrenaline-soaked minutes of combat, and then face a white-knuckle flight home. Their eyes would be glued to the fuel gauges, their minds endlessly calculating wind speed and distance, praying they had enough to make it back to the dirt strip they called home. Many didn't. They were lost not to the guns of the Japanese, but to the slow, silent tyranny of distance, their powerful, million-dollar fighters dropping silently into the endless blue after their engines sputtered, coughed, and went terrifyingly silent. Even with bulky, performance-draining external drop tanks, the P-38's operational radius was punishingly limited. Satan's Angels were flying the longest-range fighters in the theater, but it still wasn't enough. Every mission was a gamble. This was the strategic problem that haunted commanders like Macdonald. And now, the one man in the world who had made his name solving the puzzle of long-range flight was standing in his hut. But Lindbergh was a complicated, tarnished hero. His journey to that screen door was paved with both unprecedented fame and deep, divisive controversy. After his 1927 flight in the Spirit of St. Louis, a flight that was itself a masterclass in fuel management, where he landed in Paris with an astonishing 85 gallons to spare, he became a global icon. He spent the 1930s pioneering transoceanic routes for Pan American Airways, meticulously refining his techniques and becoming the world's foremost expert on getting the absolute maximum distance out of an aircraft. He learned that every engine had a secret sweet spot, an operational envelope where it could sip fuel instead of guzzling it. But his pre-war politics had made him a pariah. As a prominent leader of the America First Committee, he had argued passionately and publicly against American involvement in the war in Europe, giving speeches to massive crowds and earning the personal enmity of President Franklin Roosevelt. After Roosevelt publicly compared him to a Civil War-era traitor, Lindbergh resigned his Air Corps Reserve Commission in disgust. When war finally came with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the White House slammed the door shut on his every attempt to serve his country in uniform. But expertise finds a way. Barred from official military service, Lindbergh became a civilian technical consultant. He went to Ford's massive Willow Run plant to help troubleshoot B-24 Liberator production problems. He flew dangerous high-altitude test flights in P-47 Thunderbolts for Republic. And he worked with Vought on the F-4U Corsair. It was this corporate work that gave him a backdoor into the war he was so desperate to join. In early 1944, Lindbergh convinced United Aircraft to send him to the Pacific as a technical representative to observe P-38 operations, ostensibly to gather data that would inform the design of a future twin-engine fighter. It was a flimsy pretext for what he really wanted to do, but it was enough. The trip was authorized by the Navy, but its true nature was kept secret from the White House. He was a ghost, an unofficial, almost clandestine observer in a war he wasn't supposed to be fighting. Before he even reached the 475th, he had been observing combat with Marine Corsair squadrons, flying missions, and using his expertise to help them figure out how to safely double their bomb loads on takeoff. Word had begun to trickle through the pilot grapevine. The famous aviator was in the theater, and he knew things no one else did. On June 20th, he finally got his hands on a P-38, getting checked out for just 1 hour and 20 minutes. 6 days later, he was at Macdonald's door. The impossible was about to become routine, and the teacher was a 42-year-old civilian who had flown the P-38 for less time than it took to play a round of cards. Macdonald knew he was taking a risk, but the potential reward was too great to ignore. A dangerous sermon. Colonel Macdonald made a decision that bent every rule in the book, a choice born of desperation and a commander's intuition. He invited the civilian to fly a combat mission with them the very next day. The mission was set for dawn, so Lindbergh, to avoid the logistical hassle of returning to headquarters, stayed the night, sleeping on a spare cot in the primitive camp. As word spread like wildfire through the humid night, passed in whispers from tent to tent, the pilots of Satan's Angels reacted with a potent mix of awe and deep-seated skepticism. For the younger pilots, Lindbergh was a figure from history books, a living legend. For the more seasoned veterans, men like Major Thomas McGuire, a hard-charging ace with 15 victories to his name, the sentiment was more guarded. He was openly doubtful, telling his tent mates he wanted to see what the old guy could do. They wouldn't have to wait long. On the morning of June 27th, Lindbergh, clad in borrowed flight gear, climbed into the complex cockpit of a P-38J. As the four-ship flight roared to life and took off, Macdonald watched him with a critical eye. Lindbergh slid his powerful fighter into a perfect, rock-steady formation on McGuire's wing. For a man with less than 2 hours in the notoriously tricky aircraft, his flying was flawless, a display of innate airmanship that silenced some of the initial doubts. During the mission, a strafing run on an enemy barge, Lindbergh was the consummate professional, weaving through anti-aircraft fire as if he'd been doing it his whole life. But the real revelation, the first hint of the revolution to come, came after the mission and the ones that followed. The ground crews were the first to notice the anomaly. These were the enlisted men who refueled, rearmed, and repaired the fighters, and they knew their aircraft intimately. They noticed a bizarre pattern that defied logic. After a grueling 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance mission on July 1st, Lindbergh's P-38 landed and taxied back to its hard stand. When the ground crew chief checked the fuel, he did a double take. The aircraft had 210 gallons of fuel left in its tanks. The other pilots, who flew the exact same route for the exact same amount of time in identical aircraft, landed with their gauges hovering nervously near empty, their engines running on fumes. 2 days later, during a bomber escort mission, 2 pilots from the formation had to break off and head for home, their fuel running dangerously low. Lindbergh, however, continued the mission, hunting for targets of opportunity, his fuel gauges showing comfortable reserves. It wasn't a fluke. It was a consistent, measurable, almost magical difference. Macdonald knew he was onto something huge. He called a meeting. Under the harsh glare of the unshaded bulbs in the recreation hall, Macdonald formally introduced Lindbergh and then cut to the chase. How was he doing it? What was his secret? What happened next would change P-38 operations forever. Lindbergh stood before the assembled pilots, young, battle-hardened men who trusted their training and their instincts above all else, and calmly explained a technique that amounted to pure, unadulterated heresy. He told them, in his quiet and methodical way, that everything they had been taught about cruise control was not just inefficient, it was wrong. The standard operating procedure for the P-38 was to cruise at a high engine speed, between 2,200 and 2,400 revolutions per minute, RPM. Furthermore, they were to keep the fuel mixture set to auto-rich. This setting poured extra unburned fuel into the engine's cylinders, which acted as a coolant, protecting the powerful Allison V 1710 engines from overheating in the punishing tropical climate. It was considered the only safe way to fly, a rule written in the blood of pilots who had pushed their engines too hard. It was also, Lindbergh explained, incredibly wasteful. His technique was simple, elegant, and utterly terrifying to the men in the room. He told them to do the exact opposite of what their training manuals and instructors had drilled into them. He explained that by drastically reducing their engine speed down to 1,600 RPM, setting the fuel mixture to auto-lean instead of auto-rich, and then slightly increasing the manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury to compensate for the lower power, they could slash their fuel consumption without losing significant airspeed. Think of it like a car. Standard procedure was like driving everywhere in first gear with the gas pedal floored. You get a lot of noise and power, but your gas mileage is atrocious. Lindbergh was teaching them to shift into a higher gear, ease off the gas, and let the engine operate in its most efficient state. He then dropped the bombshell. He predicted that these settings would stretch the Lightning's combat radius by an unbelievable 400 miles, enabling 9-hour missions. When he finished, a stunned, heavy silence filled the hut. The pilots exchanged uneasy, disbelieving glances. First, the idea of a 9-hour mission was horrifying. The P-38 cockpit was notoriously cramped and uncomfortable. 7 hours was already an endurance test that left pilots exhausted, dehydrated, and sore. 9 hours seemed like a form of cruel and unusual punishment. But the far more troubling part was Lindbergh's recommended engine settings. The combination of low RPM and high manifold pressure was known as running over square, and it was a cardinal sin of aviation. Flight training hammered into every pilot's head that running an engine over square would cause detonation, or knock, inside the cylinders. This violent, uncontrolled combustion would cause the cylinder heads to rapidly overheat, leading to catastrophic engine failure. They had been taught repeatedly that if their manifold pressure, measured in inches of mercury, exceeded their RPM in hundreds, they were risking a mid-air explosion. Now this civilian was telling them to make it their standard practice. The skepticism in the room was a physical presence. One pilot openly called the technique dangerous. It went against years of training, against the very muscle memory they relied on in the chaos of combat. But Macdonald saw the bigger picture. Lindbergh wasn't a theorist spouting nonsense from a textbook. He had been doing it on combat missions. His P-38s liquid-cooled Allison V-1710 engines hadn't blown up. They ran perfectly, even cooler than usual. The proof wasn't in a manual. It was in the fuel tanks. The colonel made his decision. He would back the heretic. He ordered his men to put the gospel to the test. If it worked, Satan's angels would gain an advantage that could change the war. If it failed, they'd know soon enough. Cautiously, over the next week, the bravest of his pilots began to experiment. The first time they tried it, the sound of the engines alone was enough to make their blood run cold, redefining the battlefield. The pilots who first volunteered to try Lindbergh's technique did so with their hearts pounding in their chests. Their hands hovered nervously over the throttle and propeller controls, ready to slam everything back to standard settings at the first sign of engine cough or shudder. The initial flights were short, cautious trips, barely leaving the vicinity of the airbase. The most unnerving part, the thing that frayed their nerves more than any mechanical reading, was the sound. They were accustomed to the high-pitched, almost musical scream of the twin Allison engines spinning at 2,400 RPM. It was the sound of power, of safety. At 1,600 RPM, the engines produced a deep, guttural, almost lazy rumble. It felt fundamentally wrong, like the sound of an engine on the verge of stalling, of giving up. Every pop and crackle from the exhaust was amplified in their minds, a potential prelude to disaster. But a funny thing happened on those test flights. Nothing. The engines didn't fail. The pilots stared at their instrument panels, their eyes scanning the gauges, expecting the worst. Yet, the oil pressure needles stayed steady in the green arc. The temperature gauges remained normal. In fact, the critical cylinder head temperatures, the key indicator of the dangerous detonation they had been warned about their entire careers, actually ran cooler than they did at the higher RPM settings. The auto-lean mixture was providing just enough fuel for efficient combustion, while the lower engine speed reduced overall friction and heat. Confidence began to build, a slow dawning realization that quickly replaced fear with a palpable sense of curiosity and excitement. They started using the technique on longer missions, and the results were undeniable, almost miraculous. The fuel savings were exactly as Lindbergh had predicted. It was like discovering their fuel tanks were suddenly 50% larger. Missions that used to end with a desperate straight-line dash back to base, with no room for error, could now include an extra hour of combat air patrol, allowing them to hunt for targets of opportunity after the primary mission was complete. Flights that had been a constant source of anxiety, a relentless race against the fuel gauge, now ended with comfortable reserves. The P-38's effective combat radius, which had been a hard limit of around 570 miles, began to stretch like a rubber band. First to 700 miles, then to an incredible 750 miles. They could reach Japanese bases that had previously been completely safe from fighter attack, loiter over the target for 15 precious minutes, and still return home with a 1-hour safety reserve of fuel. The transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. The skepticism that had filled the recreation hall just days earlier evaporated, replaced by the excited buzz of pilots who had just been handed a new, invisible weapon. Lindbergh became a fixture with the 475th, flying missions regularly, teaching by example. He wasn't some aloof consultant barking orders. He was one of them, flying on their wing, sharing the same risks, eating the same canned rations. On missions he led, his call sign was simple and respectful: Mr. Lindbergh. He explained the physics in a way they could all grasp. An engine makes power by burning fuel in a series of controlled explosions. High RPM meant more and more tiny explosions every second, many of them incomplete and wasteful. His method created fewer, but more powerful and more efficient explosions per minute. The dreaded over-square setting wasn't dangerous at a moderate power level. They were using a manifold pressure of 30 inches, far below the 60-plus inches they used for war emergency power in the heat of combat. In fact, the lower RPM was actually reducing mechanical stress on the engine's pistons, bearings, and crankshafts. The technique wasn't dangerous, it was just smarter. The ultimate proof of Lindbergh's value and the immense danger he was willing to face alongside them came on July 28, 1944. He was flying with the 433rd Squadron, escorting bombers near the island of Siram. Over El Paputi Bay, the flight encountered a Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya, a light bomber. Its pilot, Captain Saburo Shimada, was no novice. He was an exceptionally skilled and experienced aviator. For 30 agonizing minutes, Shimada put on a masterclass of defensive flying, outmaneuvering multiple P-38s that tried to get on his tail. He used his aircraft's slower speed and tighter turning radius to his advantage, forcing the faster, heavier American fighters to overshoot. Pilots fired long bursts, but their tracers fell uselessly behind Shimada's impossibly tight turns. Then Shimada did something completely unexpected, a move of either supreme confidence or sheer desperation. Instead of trying to evade, he turned and flew directly at Lindbergh. The two aircraft were screaming towards each other on a collision course, closing the distance at a combined speed of nearly 500 miles per hour. For Lindbergh, this was the ultimate test. It was one thing to manage fuel in the calm of a cruise. It was another to have an enemy pilot actively trying to eliminate you in a head-on pass that would be over in a heartbeat. Whether Shimada was attempting a ramming attack or just a desperate gamble to force an overshoot, he held his course. Lindbergh didn't flinch. In that split second, his decades of experience took over. He centered the Sonya's radial engine in his gun sight and pressed the triggers. For 6 solid seconds, the P-38's nose erupted in a terrifying, concentrated torrent of cannon shells and machine gun bullets. The projectile slammed into the Sonya. Its propeller, visibly slowed, shredded by the impacts, and thick black smoke began to pour from the mangled engine. Still, Shimada came on. At the very last second, Lindbergh hauled back hard on the stick, his P-38 roaring over the crippled Japanese plane with only feet to spare. Shimada's Sonya, its controls likely shot away, went into a steep, unrecoverable dive, hitting the ocean at high speed. A brilliant fountain of white spray marked the impact. Back at base, there was no doubt among the pilots. Multiple men had fired at the Sonya, but it was Lindbergh's devastating head-on burst that had delivered the final, decisive blow. Unofficially, the civilian had secured his first aerial victory. But this victory, and his growing fame among the squadrons, put him in the crosshairs of more than just the enemy, a secret too big to keep. Lindbergh's aerial victory against Captain Shimada was the talk of the base, but it was a story told only in hushed tones and celebratory drinks among the pilots. It was never entered into the 475th's official combat records. He was a civilian, and officially documenting that he was actively engaging and downing enemy aircraft would create a bureaucratic firestorm that would undoubtedly reach Washington. Such a revelation would immediately end his invaluable work in the Pacific. The men he flew with knew the truth, and for them, that was all that mattered. The legend grew. However, this informal combat status, this walk on the wild side of military regulations, came with immense and ever-present risk. Just 3 days later, on August 1st, that risk nearly caught up to him in a lethal way. During a fighter sweep over the heavily defended Palau Islands, Lindbergh's flight tangled with a group of nimble Japanese Zeros. Lindbergh found himself locked in a classic turning dogfight with a skilled and aggressive Zero pilot. The Zero, a master of maneuverability at low and medium altitudes, was getting the upper hand, slowly but surely tightening its turn, crawling onto Lindbergh's tail. The enemy pilot was closing in, lining up for a deflection shot that Lindbergh, his P-38's energy bleeding away in the tight turn, would not be able to evade. Suddenly, his radio crackled to life. It was Colonel Macdonald's voice, not calm and commanding, but sharp and urgent. Brake right! Brake right. Lindbergh didn't hesitate. He threw his P-38 into a hard, diving right bank. As he did, Macdonald's own Lightning flashed past, its guns blazing, and engaged the Zero, forcing the enemy pilot onto the defensive and saving his life. The close call was a sobering wake-up call for 5th Air Force Headquarters. Lindbergh had done more than they could have ever hoped for. He had flown approximately 50 combat missions throughout his tour in the Pacific, about 25 of them in the P-38 with Satan's Angels. He had demonstrated a revolutionary technique that was already changing the face of the air war. He had secured an aerial victory, and he had nearly perished. It was time to get him home before their unofficial, rule-bending arrangement ended in tragedy. On August 12, 1944, Charles Lindbergh's time as a combat pilot came to an end. He left Hollandia, seen off by the pilots of the 475th, their respect for the quiet 42-year-old civilian genuine and profound. He had not just given them a technical trick. He had flown with them, fought with them, and earned his place as a true comrade in arms. The knowledge he left behind, however, had already begun to spread with the power of a game-changing revelation. The success of the 475th was impossible to ignore or keep secret. Other P-38 squadrons, seeing Satan's Angels flying longer missions, striking deeper targets, and returning with more aircraft, wanted to know their secret. Pilots from different groups talked on leave. Ground crews from different units compared fuel consumption data during maintenance. Lindbergh himself gave additional presentations before he left, patiently explaining the technique to other groups, answering technical questions, and addressing the lingering concerns about engine safety. By October, his cruise control methods were becoming standard practice throughout the 5th Air Force. The operational implications were staggering. Japanese bases on islands like Halmahera and in the Philippines, which had once been safe havens far beyond the reach of Allied fighters, now found themselves under relentless attack. Long-range bomber missions that had been flown unescorted, or not at all due to the high risk, now had P-38s protecting them all the way to the target and back. This extended range directly and powerfully impacted the grand strategy of the war. It accelerated General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign toward the Philippines. Military planners could now be bolder, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese-held islands that would have previously required costly and bloody amphibious assaults, simply because their fighters could now provide air cover from existing bases much farther away. The strategic impact was measured not just in miles gained, but in time saved, and, more importantly, in American lives. Pilots who would have been lost to fuel starvation after sustaining combat damage now had the precious reserves to make it home. Unexpectedly, strong headwinds or bad weather that forced detours were no longer an automatic death sentence. It is important to clarify a common myth that has persisted for decades. Some have incorrectly attributed the success of the legendary April 1943 mission to intercept and shoot down the transport aircraft of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to Lindbergh's techniques. This is incorrect. That mission, an incredible feat of long-range flying and navigation in its own right, occurred more than a year before Lindbergh even set foot in the Pacific. What Lindbergh did was take that kind of extreme range, high-risk, once-in-a-lifetime mission and make it a safe, repeatable, everyday occurrence. The extended range proved particularly decisive during the liberation of the Philippines. In October 1944, P-38s flying from bases in New Guinea and Morotai provided crucial fighter cover over the invasion beaches at distances that would have been pure fantasy just a few months earlier. The human element of Lindbergh's achievement deserves special emphasis. He was a man in his 40s, flying in one of the most physically demanding environments imaginable, against skilled enemy pilots who were often half his age. He endured the same physical strains and mental stresses of combat as the young lieutenants he flew with. His willingness to personally demonstrate his techniques under fire was the absolute key to their acceptance. Had he simply lectured from the safety of a rear echelon headquarters, he would have been dismissed as just another theorist who didn't understand the realities of combat. By proving his methods in the sky, time and again, he earned a credibility that transcended his controversial past and outshone his celebrity. The men who flew with him, men who were legends in their own right, like Major Richard Bong, America's ace of aces, with 40 victories, respected him immensely. Bong told a United Press reporter, "Lindbergh was as hot a pilot as any of us. He would have been out there knocking off Japs every day if General Kenny had let him." Coming from America's top ace, that was the ultimate validation. But even as his techniques became official doctrine, a deeper question remained about how this incredible, rule-breaking episode was allowed to happen in the first place. Knowledge as a weapon. In the final analysis, Lindbergh's incredible contribution to the war effort highlights an often uncomfortable but essential truth about large, complex institutions. Sometimes the most vital and transformative innovations come from the outside, from individuals who have the perspective and the courage to challenge the established, by-the-book doctrine. Lindbergh's well-documented pre-war political stance had made him a pariah in Washington, D.C. President Roosevelt's personal and public animosity ensured he would never wear a United States military uniform again. Yet, the military, particularly the Army Air Forces in the Pacific, desperately needed the very expertise that he, perhaps alone in the world, possessed. The solution they found, an unofficial, irregular, and highly unorthodox status as a civilian observer who actively participated in combat, would likely be impossible under modern rules of engagement. But in the desperate, pragmatic, results-oriented reality of 1944, it worked. The institution bent its own rigid rules because the operational necessity was too great, and the result was an immeasurable benefit to the war effort. After returning to the United States in mid-August, Lindbergh's work for the war did not stop. He participated in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter aircraft performance, where he flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, providing crucial intelligence and insights into enemy capabilities. He continued to consult for United Aircraft and other manufacturers, troubleshooting problems and offering his unique perspective. The techniques he had pioneered in the jungles of New Guinea were formally adopted and disseminated. The Army Air Forces published new, updated cruise control charts for the P-38 that officially reflected his discoveries. What had been a dangerous, whispered heresy just months before was now the official, mandated way to fly. The numbers tell the powerful story. The P-38J, with its internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons, supplemented by external drop tanks, could see its effective combat radius jump from a nail-biting 570 miles to over 750 miles, a more than 30% improvement that changed strategic calculations across the theater. The 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, the first to adopt his methods, finished the war as the top P-38 unit with an incredible 551 aerial victories. The people watching this story unfold, seeing the dramatic impact of this one man, might be wondering, could this all be true? Did one man, in just a few weeks, really figure out a trick that thousands of trained pilots and engineers had missed? The thing is, it wasn't an overnight trick. It was the culmination of decades of obsessive focus on fuel efficiency, a passion that began long before his legendary flight across the Atlantic and was honed during his years of survey work across the Pacific. He saw an aircraft not just as a weapon, but as a complex dynamic system of interconnected variables. While military pilots were trained, for very good reasons, to follow the manual to ensure safety and standardization, Lindbergh had the unique freedom and the deep, specialized knowledge to question the manual itself. Are we missing a key detail here? Perhaps the most important detail is that Lindbergh didn't invent new technology. He didn't design a new engine or a more aerodynamic wing. He perfected the application of the existing technology. He proved that the greatest weapon is not always a bigger engine or a better gun, but a deeper, more profound understanding of the tools you already have. He demonstrated a principle that remains critically relevant today. Even in a rigid hierarchy like the military, evidence-based results can and must overcome ingrained dogma. His success encouraged commanders to listen more closely to the civilian technical representatives attached to their units, fostering a crucial, collaborative link between the warfighters on the front lines and the engineers in the factories that accelerated the pace of technical innovation throughout the rest of the war. He was, above all, a teacher. He earned the unwavering respect of his students, not through his rank or his fame, but by proving his lessons in the ultimate classroom, the crucible of combat. Decades after the war, the surviving pilots of the 475th, men like Colonel Warren Lewis, who had commanded the 432nd Squadron, could still recall his recommended engine settings with perfect clarity. The memory wasn't just of numbers on a gauge, but of the quiet, confident man who taught them how to fly farther, fight longer, and, most importantly, come home safely. Charles Augustus Lindbergh passed away in 1974, a figure still shrouded in both fame and controversy. But his quiet technical legacy from the Pacific is undeniable. It is not about the unofficial victory or the missions flown, but about the knowledge he shared so freely. He arrived as a celebrity outcast and departed as a respected comrade. He transformed an aircraft's capabilities through the simple power of understanding, proving that sometimes the impossible is merely a limit waiting to be broken by someone who dares to look at the problem in a new way. Lindbergh's story shows that sometimes one brilliant outsider can see what an entire institution misses. Does that mean our established systems are fundamentally flawed? Or was he just a once-in-a-lifetime exception? Let us know your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more.